Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture. This is, again, Unit 0, the Middle Ages, and the section we are learning about today is Section 2, where we will be exploring the social themes, or the different social organization and development within the context of the Middle Ages. Now, for this lecture and for all future lectures, we will have an objective. The objective helps guide our learning and guide our thinking as we work through the lecture. And then also you will see that the objective is also the writing prompt for you at the end of the lecture. So this is going to be standard form. You'll want to get used to it, that you'll always be expected to respond to the objective at the end of the section. Okay, so the first major social topic in the medieval era is the development of Menorialism. Menorialism is a system of economic and social organization between landlords and peasant laborers, who we also call serfs, who live on estates, which we call manors. So you can see in the image to your right an example of a medieval manor. This is a more developed medieval manor that we might see in the not immediately after the fall of Rome, but maybe closer to the High Middle Ages. Now, Menorialism emerged as a social system in the immediate post-Roman era. As the Roman Empire declined in the 4th and 5th centuries, many people throughout Europe could no longer depend on its stability or protection or resources. Barbarian invasions from Germanic tribes threatened local communities. Therefore, common people began to come together around whoever was the strongest or wealthiest person in the region for protection. And these strongmen were usually land-owning patricians, as they were known in ancient Rome. Land-owning patricians. Patricians were the upper class of ancient Rome. But now they're going to be known as landlords or nobles. We'll talk about that group more specifically here in just a moment. Also, cities and larger towns had started to become dangerous because they were targets for these barbarian invaders. So most of these communities or villages emerged in more rural areas, so farther away from cities and in the countryside. And in this period, people were focused purely on survival and safety in small numbers, right? They band together just to try to survive. So that means these manors, these villages, had very low levels of production and technology. These were very localized and very isolated communities, right? So they were very localized, they were very isolated. There was basically no trade and no contact with other communities. There was no intellectual development in these communities. And there really, like I said, was no communication with the outside world. These manors had to be mostly self-sustaining, meaning they needed to create everything that they needed to survive within the manor. Again, they could not rely on trade, they could not rely on markets or anything like that. They had to survive for themselves. Now, of course, this also meant that these manors were vulnerable to warfare, to raids, and yes, barbarians, Vikings, and the lot would attack these manors. Life was still very difficult and brutal. That's part of what makes the early medieval period part of the Dark Ages. Now, the social system in the manor was based on these reciprocal obligations. So the peasants, or serfs, as they're known in this context, had to work for the lord. And the serfs were obligated to give their lord a portion of the produce that they harvested. This produce was usually things like wheat and barley and other types of grain. But also these serfs had to give up certain freedoms, meaning they were legally tied to the land and they could not leave. But they're not full-on slaves, right? So a serf is not equivalent to a slave, but a serf is also not an entirely free person, right? So they, for example, could not just move away from the manor. And the reason this rule existed is because the manor depended on their presence for survival. So lords, as we start to call these landlords, the people who are in charge of everything, in return, they protected the serfs and they helped to provide for their everyday needs. So the landlord would provide things like the mill and other supplies that the serfs would need to survive. Um, and again, these labor obligations were necessary in order for the manor to survive as a whole. Again, it's very community focused, but also we have the lord at the top and then all the serfs below him. Now, this system would actually give rise to some local political systems and also the emergence of some of our medieval social groups. So these landlords are going to become a group that we know as the nobility. So the lord, as we see, can serve as the political head of this manor or this village, right? He could exert significant control over the serfs. So these lords, these nobles, become the local politicians, right? So when we refer to this term of someone as a lord, that means they're a member of the nobility, right? Or the aristocracy. And the way we specifically define someone in this social group is land plus title. So they need to own land and they need to have a fancy title, and that makes them a member of the nobility. And this land and title is inherited, all right? It is very, very difficult for people to rise up into the nobility. I mean, it does happen occasionally, and we'll talk about that later on. But ultimately, this is an inherited social class. So again, it's land plus title equals nobility. And these titles were usually like the baron of this place or the earl of another place, right? A baron, an earl, a duke, something like that. Now, in agricultural society, which is really most of European history until we get to the Industrial Revolution, status, social status, was defined by land ownership. So if you owned land, that meant you had higher status. Now, during the Middle Ages, the nobility was more closely associated with warfare. Again, we can see that because of the need for protection, but this also ties into the rise of knights and knighthood in the Middle Ages. And by the High Middle Ages, we really are defining the nobility by land plus title equals a noble. And this system of menorialism was really the most common form of localized political organization until we get to about the 9th century. And the 9th century is when we start to see significant invasions from Vikings wreaking havoc across Europe, rape, murder, pillage, burn type of stuff. And that's what will prompt the creation of larger, more complex political systems, which we'll learn about in the next lecture. Now, before we move on to our next slide, I do want to take a moment to discuss the difference between a peasant and a serf, because peasants play an important role throughout European history. Most people are peasants. If you are of European descent, then sorry to say, your ancestors were probably peasants. So a peasant is someone who lives in a rural area, so they live in the countryside, and they survive on subsistence agriculture, meaning all they do is work in agriculture year in, year out in the countryside. And really, they're only creating enough agriculture for their own survival. Okay, so anyone who works in the countryside in agriculture throughout history, we can consider them a peasant. Whereas a serf is a peasant who has given up certain freedoms and has entered into this reciprocal relationship of menorialism. So by this logic, all serfs are peasants, but not all peasants are serfs. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, all serfs are peasants, but not all peasants are serfs. And like I mentioned, the vast majority of the European population all throughout history falls into the category of being a peasant. Now, on to our next slide. Our next slide is sort of a general overview of some of the major social systems and also some of the relevant major events that affected these social systems in the Middle Ages. Now, we talked about menorialism as sort of an early form of social organization that's really defined in the early the early medieval period. But by the time we get to the High Middle Ages and later on, we're going to see the creation of the more common and traditional medieval social system, which is called the Three Estates. So you can think of the Three Estates as three different groups. This includes the First Estate, which is the clergy. Clergy are people who work for the church, so priests, bishops, monks, nuns, right? These are people who work for the church. Their role is to pray and care for the souls for everyone in Europe, and they are the highest estate. Then we have the second estate. This is the nobility, right? The nobility is everyone who governed and fought and protected and ruled. Really, this is probably the most powerful political estate in a lot of ways, although the church, as we will see, does have more power than governments for quite some time. And then the third estate is everybody else, absolutely everybody else. And this was mostly peasants or serfs who labored in the fields. Now, this system is also sometimes referred to as the three orders or the tripartite society. We'll see it referred to that in a later reading. And what's important about this system is that the legal rights of a person were tied directly to your estate, right? So you were born into your estate and you were not able to move out of it. There was little to no mobility. But also, this was based more or less on a system of reciprocity. At least that was the logic behind it. Each group played a role in a reciprocal system. So if we look here on this slide, we can see how they envisioned that reciprocal system, right? The first estate provided instruction to the third estate. They also provided moral authority to the second estate, whereas the second estate provided privileges and exemptions to the first estate. You will see that the first and second estate are always best buddies throughout history. And then the second estate provides, rule and protection and leadership to the third estate. Whereas the third estate, they provide material support, right? They do all the farming, they do all the work to support the people in the first and the second estate. Now, this is really the primary social structure for many, many parts of Europe that will last as late as the 18th century. And this is actually one of the things, this outdated social structure that lingers into the 18th century will be one of the factors that starts the French Revolution later on. But that's, of course, another story for another day. The last group we can talk about in this system is sort of an outlier, and those were the townspeople. So the townspeople actually did not really fit into this typical system. If anything, we would consider them part of the third estate, but they were actually more of an exception to the system because towns had a lot of independence in the Middle Ages, and townspeople were not under the rule of the nobility. And they had, different freedoms, different privileges. They played a different role in medieval society, and we'll talk more about that later on. All right, so our next topic is women, the role of women in the Middle Ages. Now, Europe has been a patriarchal society since antiquity, and patriarchal, of course, means a male-dominated society. That began way back in ancient Greece. So there was no gender equality. Women of all social classes were expected to be wives and mothers. And this perception and limitation of women was strongly influenced by the religious culture of Europe. Also, for women, their role of wife and mother was both honorable but also limiting, right? Women almost were the sole caregivers of children, and also childbirth was very risky. It was actually the leading death rate for women, basically until we get to the 19th and 20th centuries in modern medicine, thank goodness. Now, if a woman did not want to become a wife or a mother, sometimes she might be able to become a nun, right? She could enter the church and become a nun. This might be an alternative path to marriage and child rearing, but not every woman could afford to become a nun or had that opportunity or those connections. If this was a higher class woman who chose this route, she might be able to have some authority. So she might be an abbess, someone who runs a nunnery and is in charge of other nuns. Or if this is a higher class woman who does choose the wife and mother role and can be married off to someone powerful, she can become a queen, like a queen regent, and actually maybe have a little bit of political influence. We'll see a few examples of those type of women. But ultimately, women had no property rights, right? They had no legal rights. Sometimes they could participate in trade. Sometimes they could belong to craft guilds in these towns. And one of the reasons women's roles were so limited was, again, the dominance of Christianity in the culture of medieval Europe. And medieval Christianity really encouraged two opposing attitudes as a way to view women. You know, women could be viewed in the same vein as the Virgin Mary, right? Because the church venerated the Virgin Mary and also many other female saints. And this attitude could give women some more cultural and religious prestige, right? This was a more respectful, ideal depiction of women. But then at the same time, medieval Christianity placed considerable emphasis on Eve, of Adam and Eve, as the source of sin, right? And there was lots of language and literature about how women were evil and they corrupted men and women couldn't be trusted, right? So women were either, you know, saintly like the Virgin Mary or they were evil like Eve. And also, other aspects of medieval culture played into these limitations, such as the code of chivalry. So the code of chivalry we might think today as being a way to respect women, like let me open the door for you, or let me let me do nice things for you, right? Someone who is chivalrous, we think of that as being someone who's very kind and goes out of their way to be nice to a woman, to take care of her. But actually, the code of chivalry historically reinforced ideas that women were weak, women were delicate, women were subordinate to men, right? Women needed to be taken care of. That's really the origin in the code of chivalry. Also, many parts of medieval literature discussed women's roles as being comforters to men. So women should only exist to comfort men, to take care of men. Lots of medieval literature listed and praised the docile feminine virtues of women, to be that wife and mother and caregiver. However, there are a handful of very famous, notable, pretty awesome historical women from the Middle Ages, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was the queen consort, meaning the wife of the king for France and England, so she was very powerful. There was Joan of Arc, who we'll learn about with the Hundred Years' War. Catherine of Siena, we'll read some of her writings, or Catherine of Siena, who was this famous nun, and then Christine de Pizan, who is a famous author, and we will read some of her writings later on in this unit. All right, so now we're going to move on to talk about two major events that take place in the later Middle Ages that actually have a significant effect on the social structure and social systems of Europe. So the first is the Black Death. So the Black Death was a topic that we learned about in Boost last year, so hopefully you might have some recollection on this topic. But the Black Death, or the Black Plague, was one of the most devastating pandemics in all of human history. If you look at this map over here, we can see that the plague came in from the east. So the plague was transported from China into Europe via these trade routes along the Asian continent, and it came into Europe through the Crimean Peninsula and into Constantinople, and then across the Mediterranean Sea. It went first to Italy and then went throughout all of Europe. This is considered to be, frankly, the most devastating natural disaster in Western history. Estimates are the Black Death killed about a third of the population of Europe overall. However, the death rate tended to be higher in urbanized areas where people lived, in close quarters. So places like Italy and France and England, which had those bigger towns and cities by this point, saw higher death rates. And the death rate was so devastating that the population of Europe did not really recover and get back to where it was until the year 1500, until the 16th century. Now, there were a variety of reactions to the plague. We'll go back to this slide here. Many people saw the plague as a punishment from God. And so this led to a spike in religious extremism, people who would, pray and beg for forgiveness. Some people would go so far as to engage in self mutilation as a form of forgiveness and attempting to please God and apologize for their sins that inevitably caused the plague, right? This idea that God sent us the plague to punish us for our sins. This is, of course, um, almost an appropriate reaction when we see the extreme influence of Christianity in medieval Europe. Now, another unfortunate reaction was to have a scapegoat, to blame another group. And in this case, many Europeans decided to blame the Jews. So the Jews were a minority in Europe, and they had always been considered sort of an outsider group that were not welcome because, again, they were not Christian. And so, unfortunately, as a result of blaming the Jews for the Black Death, there were mass murders of Jews. We call these pogroms, Pogroms. And these mass murders of Jews in different areas of Europe demonstrated, the anti-Semitism that was also extremely present in European society. So this is important to remember that anti-Semitism, so anti-Semitism means the hatred of Jews. Anti-Semitism has deep, deep roots in European history going well into the Middle Ages. It didn't even begin with the Black Plague, right? Because anti-Semitism existed before the plague, that was a reason for people to blame the Jews for the plague afterwards. Now, as a result of the anti-Semitism and the violence towards Jews in the years following the Black Death, many Jews migrated into Eastern Europe. And so we're going to see there's a concentration of more Jewish population in Eastern Europe, and that will be significant later on. But overall, the Black Death had dramatic effects on the European economy and labor system and social structure as well. One of the more immediate results of the Black Death on the European economy and the European labor system was a series of peasant revolts that took place in the later 14th century. So because all these people died from the Black Death, it caused a labor shortage, right? So labor, we can think of it as a commodity. And now if we have a scarcity of labor, but a high demand, what happens to the price of labor? The price of labor goes up, right? And so there's a dramatic rise in the price of labor, meaning what people are being paid, what their wages are. Now, of course, the nobility did not want to pay peasants higher wages. The nobility continually tried to limit the wages of peasants. They even passed laws to try to push wages down to pre-plague levels, right? So one of these famous laws is called the English Statute of Laborers. The English Statute of Laborers. It was created in England in 1351, excuse me. And again, it wanted to limit the wages of peasants, and it also wanted to make those peasants serfs again. It wanted to make them serfs and limit their mobility and their freedoms. And so these, the resistance of the nobility and the complaints of the peasants ultimately would give rise to a series of peasant revolts across Europe, especially in places like France, in major cities, in England, in Italy as well. And these were generally concentrated more in urban areas, right? But there were also some rural uprisings as well. There was a massive peasant revolt in England in 1831, actually. So on this map here, you can see some of the areas where those peasant revolts took place. Now, as a result of the Black Death, the conditions for peasants generally improved a little bit, but not uniformly. It does help bring about the end of Menorialism, right? It does help the decline of Menorialism, and it does also change the economy as we start to see labor services converted to wages, right? So instead of just, labor service, people are being paid a wage. So the transition from a more like labor and service-based economy to a more cash-based economy is another effect of the Black Death on Europe. And so that, of course, has social ramifications as well. But are there major social changes, right? Is there suddenly full on equality? No, of course not. We're not even going to see the beginnings of that type of social equality until we're into the 20th century. Peasants are still part of that third estate. They are still going to be controlled and exploited by the nobility. The nobility will remain in power and they will do everything they can to keep themselves in power for the next several hundred years. So now, what you'll need to do at the end of this lecture, now that we've reached the end, is to do your write-up. So your write-up, again, is to respond to the objective we saw at the start of the lecture, to explain the key characteristics of the medieval social structure and what led to or influenced the creation and characteristics of these social structures. So your write-up should be about 1 paragraph in length, and here's a couple other tips to consider. The first sentence should establish the topic of the paragraph, but don't just repeat the objective, right? Make an argument, make a claim, make a statement, and then explain it in the rest of the paragraph and use examples. And don't worry, we're going to get lots of chance to practice this type of writing. So just do your best for right now. Now, once you finish your write-up, I'm going to ask you to do one more thing before class. I would like you to read 2 secondary source readings. You're going to read the 2 articles that I have linked at the end of your notes in OneNote, which compare the elements of the Black Death and the current COVID-19 pandemic. So we will be discussing these articles in class, so make sure you read them. You don't need to write anything down except maybe a couple notes for your own thoughts and your own recollection, but be prepared to discuss the articles. I will expect that you have read them. And these are the type of questions that we're going to be discussing and exploring in class. So you might want to keep these in the back of your mind as you read through those articles. Again, those links can be found at the end of the notes in your OneNote for this section. Otherwise, that ends our lecture on section 2, Social Organization and Development in the Middle Ages. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.